Hi, my name is Leah Day, and welcome to Quilt Along number 1. This is the very first week of our Quilt Along, and we're ready to get started learning some very basic designs for free motion quilting. The design we're going to focus on this week is stippling, and we're going to focus on a very elementary version of stippling, a very simplistic version. Because the fact is, stippling, when it's really complex and kind of wiggly and wobbly and all over the place, it's really hard to understand. It's hard to figure out how exactly to stitch that. So we're going to break that down into some very basic shapes and practice those first in rows. So let's watch that video and see how that works on the sewing machine. So let's get started by first pulling up our bobbin thread, tucking it behind the foot so that way it's out of the way. And we're going to start making these very simple, very big U shapes on the surface of the quilt. And you can see on this fabric sandwich, it's just, layer of fabric, piece of batting, and another layer of fabric. I have marked some lines, and these are around 3 inches apart. So that might help you kind of get a visual on how big this is and how much I'm moving the quilt with each pass. Of course, because it's this big, it's a half of yard, I had to baste it and I had to use pens, so I'm gonna have to stop occasionally and take those pens out. But what I want you to see as I stitch this is just how making these soft, simple curves is a very good way to practice stippling. It might not seem like it's very advanced, but this is a really good foundation and it will set the store for a more complex design. Once you practice that a bit on a big scale, you might also want to practice it on a slightly smaller scale. Here you can see this is around half the size, and I'm just wiggling this in right on the edge of my practice piece. And I did this just simply because I was a little worried creating this video that you wouldn't be able to see what I was doing because I'm stitching so big from the angle of my camera. But I'm pretty pleased with how this is turning out. I think that you can see what I'm doing pretty clearly. So now, once you've really experimented with that and played with it and have taken some time to play with just that very basic line of shapes, let's add one element of complexity to it. What we're going to do is do a simple wiggle and then a second wiggle and then going ahead and swirl on down and come back up again. It's a very simple modification of that first design. You're just doing 2 humps and then coming down, and on the bottom you're only doing 1 hump. And the reason why this is kind of a good practice for stippling is because it's just adding one element of complexity. We're going for those simple U shapes to one single addition. And then of course if you can do that on one side, having those 2 humps on the top and 1 hump on the bottom, then you can do the reverse. You can do 2 humps on the bottom and 1 hump on top. And that's what I'm doing here. And once you get the hang of both of those, then of course you can put the 2 together. You swirl into a hump, come up, come back down, then immediately go up and do the same thing. Swirl up into a hump, do a second one, and wiggle on down. And this way you're combining the 2 shapes together into a single line. Each of these lines, make sure to stitch each of these lines on your quilt at least a couple times to get a good amount of practice. I'm showing them all here in barely a couple seconds for each one. I really want you to take your time and practice each of these. Now this particular set of shapes, I like this one quite a lot. It's called the lobster claw. I'm going to try and talk you through it real quick. Basically you create a little hump and then you take and swirl around a big long skinny hump to go around it. And this creates kind of a lobster claw effect. It's a really nice way of getting yourself out of sticky situations, as I've found. And here's the reverse. This time I made the hump kind of coming from the top and then I swirled around coming down to the bottom. It has a slightly different effect, a slightly different look from the design that we were stitching before. Now let's put some of these elements together and create a much more complex version of stippling, still on that big scale, but just combining those elements together. So we did, the two hump design. Now we're going to do the lobster claw. It's combining those simple shapes together to create a more complex path. Now I'm just going to go into a simple single U shape and then double it. And then of course you can stitch any of these sideways. They don't all have to be stitched just up and down along the edges of your quilting space. You can also stitch them sideways. Here I'm stitching a couple this way, getting rid of a pen, get that out of my way, and then I'll stitch a few more running in the opposite direction. While I'm running through all of these so quickly in this video, I hope that you will see that each of these was stitched out in its own individual line, and that I really think you should take the time to practice each one in a line of quilting, or even take one and stitch an entire quilt with it. This was just the simple U shapes was the exact way that I quilted my first quilt in free motion, just simply stitching U shapes over the surface. So now you have a really good base to start with when it comes to stippling. You have some very simple wiggly shapes that will get you started making that nice smooth curving line. This kind of movement is really what you're making on the surface of your machine, and you want to be able to make it smoothly and evenly without a lot of jerks and jags, because that's not going to produce a smooth, even stitch. So even just going up and down in that U-shaped stitch, making rows of that, that's a great way to practice. I would advise you to at least work on a half-yard sample or a fairly big block, so that way you can get a lot of practice making these smooth shapes on your sewing machine. I wouldn't go too big. I wouldn't have a twin-size quilt for something like this, but I certainly would maybe devote a half to a full yard of fabric to practicing this design and this series of shapes. So I hope you have fun playing with these designs on your sewing machine this week, and you'll post your progress on your own blog. Make sure to link up next Wednesday when we follow along with Quilt Along number 2. Keep in mind, all of this information is being published through the Free Motion Quilting Project at freemotionproject.com.